What's good, family? And welcome back to another week on Guns and Butter with your favorite cousin, Kinda G. Now, I couldn't decide if I wanted to drop this week, but hell, I already did the research on this particular case, so I can't take my foot off the gas pedal now. I just gotta drop it. So I'm gonna do this older case just because the research is already done for it. And then the weeks following, I'm gonna try to do some more hot on the market cases for y'all, okay? So, like I said, this case is a little bit older. A lot of people have covered it already, and you may have already heard about it, but that's okay. You haven't heard me tell it. So, sit down, get comfortable, let's do this. Now, before we jump right into it, I do want to give y'all a little disclaimer, a little trigger warning, and let y'all know that this case does involve the sexual violence to kids. So, listeners' discretion is advised.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
So this week at the dinner table, I'm going to be telling you guys about a couple by the name of Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. Now, the reason why they inherited the name the Black Bonnie and Clyde was because in the summer of 1984, they went on a killing spree, committing crimes across Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. The two of them together had absolutely no good sense, but I'm going to tell you all about them. Alton Coleman was born November 6, 1955, in Waukegan, Illinois. Now, he was the third of 5 children, and he was raised on the Market Street area of Waukegan. Now, I've never heard of Market Street. I guess I'm not really familiar with Illinois, but it's a blue-collar, predominantly black city on Lake Michigan between Chicago and Milwaukee. And he was raised by his mom and his grandma, whose name is Alma Hosa. And in Alton's case, when I say raised, I mean it very loosely. Growing up in his household, he really didn't have a childhood. He had to grow up really fast and he had to see a lot of stuff. From the time he was a child, he never knew real love. His mom never showed him any affection, never loved on him. When he was born, she literally threw him in the trash, like set him in the trash can. It was his grandma who came behind his mom, picked him up from the trash, and pretty much said, "Nah, you can't just leave the baby in the trash. I mean, you don't have to raise it, but you can't put it in the trash." Listen, I don't know if she exactly said that, but she came and got Alton out the dumpster, okay? But the reason why his mom most likely didn't want to raise him was because she was a known prostitute around town. And his grandmama wasn't any better. She ran a brothel and a gambling house out the same house they all lived in. So in Alton's household, he was exposed to a lot of drugs, violence, physical and sexual abuse, including bestiality, which I soon figured out that means to have sex with animals. Like, come on now. And if that wasn't bad enough, he also seen his grandma and his mama engaging in orgies. Ugh. And in addition to that, to make things even worse, his grandmama also practiced voodooism. So she was forcing Alton to kill animals and harvest their bodies. Listen, because I would have said, y'all could have just left me in the trash for this mess. Now, being that he experienced all of this at such a young age in his home, you have to wonder what type of personality he had. He was described as somebody who kept to himself for the most part, and he was slow to react, like he wasn't really emotional. But he was really just a kid, and all he wanted was to go to school and be normal. But when he went to school, he was teased so badly that he dropped out at the end of middle school. So one of the main reasons why he ended up dropping out of school at such a young age was because his classmates would always tease him and call him pissy and shitty. Y'all excuse my language, but they really did actually call him that. No, seriously, they said that he never had any clean clothes to change into, so he always smelled like poop and pee. And on top of that, even still in middle school, he was wet in the bed. But after dropping out, he started working at the local VA hospital. And the older he got, the more he became known for his short temper around the neighborhood, and he was always known to carry a knife. But pretty typical, he ended up joining a local street gang, and he got the nickname of Big Al around the hood. So when Alton was around the age of 18, it was on December 27th, 1973, he committed his first known sexual offense. And from then on out, he never stopped committing crimes. On December 27th, he abducted 54-year-old Eleanor McIntyre at gunpoint. He raped her, then stole her car and her money. Now, he was caught for this crime, but after he took a plea deal, he was only charged with armed robbery, so he only spent 2 years in jail. So when he was released from prison this time, he started acting really weird. He would dress in women's clothing, and openly expressed his interest in anal sex. Now, he eventually went on to be identified as pansexual. I had to look that one up too because I had no idea what that meant. So, pansexual is described as someone who has intercourse with women, men, children, objects. Basically, he stuck his penis in anything willingly and unwillingly. Children shouldn't really be in that definition, but let's continue on. Now, along with him experiencing the trauma at home, he was now starting to associate sex with violence. And to add to his troubles, he also suffered from a personality disorder as well as a brain dysfunction. So, as you can see, he had a lot going on mentally from a young age. Now, the same year he was released from prison in 1976, he was also tried and acquitted for the rape of a 17-year-old girl by the name of Sherry Patterson. So the reason why he was acquitted for this was because somehow, some way, he convinced the jury that the sex was consensual. But listen to how foul this man was. While he was being held in the pre-trial detention for Sherry's assault, he was charged with assaulting 3 male inmates, and for that he was only convicted of battery. Ugh. Continuing on down this man's rap sheet, 3 years later in 1980, he was charged with the rape of 22-year-old Dorothy Hawkins, who just so happened to be a U.S. Navy soldier. And guess what? He was acquitted of those charges too. The way he was able to get off so easily on these rape charges is reminding me of Samuel Little. It's just so strange how the justice system works to me because you can watch somebody get 30, 40 years for a drug charge and then turn around and only give somebody 2 to 3 years max for a rape charge, if that. And listen to this. Just a year later in 1981, he was involved in the sexual assault of an underage girl. And then he turned around and raped that young girl's 14-year-old friend. And get this, both of those cases were dismissed due to lack of probable cause. But this man just didn't stop. That following year in 1982, he was a suspect in the rape and murder of a 15-year-old girl. Y'all, these dates with all the crimes he committed just keep coming. In May of 1983, his sister Terry Coleman walked into the police station claiming that he tried to molest his 8-year-old niece Melinda Snow. But shortly after coming forward with these allegations, that case was dismissed as well, because Terry ended up changing her story around saying that it was just all one big misunderstanding within the family, and quote, "A lot of families go through this. It doesn't make a difference now," end quote. And all the while Alton was running around terrorizing Waukegan, he still somehow found time to sweet talk and con a teenager by the name of Beverly Perkins into marrying him. The two of them got married on July 1st, 1980. But after only 6 months, she ended up calling the police to get an escort to get all of her belongings out of his grandma's house. She just couldn't deal with his obsession with bondage and young girls and violent sex, so that following year they divorced. On February 28th of 1984, in North Chicago, Alton raped a 14-year-old girl at knife point. Now, after being arrested and arraigned for this crime, he was released on bail. But instead of sticking around to face the consequences, he skipped town and went on a 7-week crime spree with his new boo by the name of Debra Brown. Deborah Denise Brown was born November 11th, 1962. She was one of 11 children. Now, her home life wasn't as hectic as Alton's. Though it wasn't perfect, she didn't live in a sex ring with complete chaos 24/7 with a mother that didn't want her. She did have a father with severe mental health problems, and he was an alcoholic, so he was physically and mentally abusive to her and her siblings. And just like her man Alton, Deborah suffered from head trauma as a young child. Now, the circumstances of her injury are unclear, but it was severe enough to impact her cognitive development. So due to this head injury, she was reportedly borderline intellectually disabled or retarded. Hey, those are not my words, okay? But let's continue. In 1980, when she was about 17 or 18 years old, she overdosed. Now, we're not exactly sure what drug it was she overdosed on, but she was hospitalized for it. But soon after that, she met a man and she became engaged to him. But that didn't last long because one day in 1983, Deborah was at a bar in Illinois, and she met a man by the name of Alton Coleman. Now, we don't know what it was about him, but she quickly became infatuated with Alton. She broke up with her fiancé, moved out of his house, and she moved right in with Alton and his grandmama. And from then on out, she started taking care of Alton's grandmama. She was her full-time live-in caregiver, and I read somewhere that Alton was only giving her about $5 a week for this. You left your fiance to come live with Alton and his grandmama and take care of her too? For $5 a week? So I read a little bit ahead into the trial, and a psychologist that testified during the trial said that Debra was subjected to frequent physical and sexual abuse. So she had a really strong sense of rejection and abandonment, all of which probably made her feel right at home when it came to Alton. But for some strange reason, they had this instant, powerful connection. Now, maybe it was the fact that they were both a little retarded, a little slow, and they understood one another. But either way, Debra was young and eager to please her new man, Alton. Now, reports describe Debra as being a prisoner in Alton's home, saying that when she left home without him, he would beat her. And when they were out in public, folks said that she was always walking a step behind him. Now, it was around this time while he was dating Debra when Alton's thoughts just became dark. All the years of abuse, neglect, and hatred turned him into a ticking time bomb of perversion and violence. So if y'all remember, Alton was already facing charges in Chicago for raping a 14-year-old girl by the name of Shalandria Thompson. But he didn't care. Like I said, he went on the run. So while he's out living his best life with Debra, in late May of 1984, Alton sparks up yet another friendship with a woman by the name of Juanita Wheat. Now, Juanita lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and when Alton introduced himself, he introduced himself as a man by the name of Robert Knight. And he told her that he only lived 2 blocks away from her. He was really a habitual liar. Like, we all know you live at your granny's house in Waukegan. But Juanita had just met him. She had no reason to not believe him. He came off as a nice, normal guy. They chatted for a while. He hung around while she did her laundry. And they were just getting along just fine. He also was starting to get acquainted with her 9-year-old daughter, Vernita, and her son, Brandon. So they hang out a couple of times. They get acquainted. And on May 29th, after only knowing Juanita and her kids for a few weeks, Alton asked Juanita if he can take her 9-year-old daughter, Vernita, on a ride down the street to his house to pick up some speakers he wanted to gift to her. He even went as far as to offer an address to make it seem legit. But instead of taking little Vernita to pick up the stereo system like he said, he locked the car doors and drove her to Waukegan. He stopped at an abandoned building, raped and strangled her. Then he covered her with a corduroy jacket, zipping her up backwards, almost like a straitjacket, and just left her there. And after leaving her little lifeless body in the abandoned building, he went straight home to Deb like nothing happened. So by now, Alton pretty much had nothing left to lose. He was already facing a charge that could land him on death row, and it was almost as if Vernita's death was like his floodgate moment, because it opened up the door for more violence. And Debra's little slow ass was going to stick beside her man during his hard times. And by June of 1984, Alton was 28 at the time. He was on the run. And Debra, who was 21 at the time, went wherever he went. Now, whether it was out of fear or love or just a toxic blend of both, when the cops came looking for him, she lied to the police about his whereabouts. So from then on out, Alton knew that Debra was going to hold it down and carry every last one of his secrets. So after they left Waukegan, they drove a couple hours south, stopping in Gary, Indiana. And while authorities were on the hunt for these two, they were on a hunt of their own. And after laying low in Gary for a couple of weeks, they found their next victims. On the afternoon of June 18th, 7-year-old Tamika Hertz was walking home from the candy store with her aunt, 9-year-old Annie Hillard, when they crossed paths with Alton and Debra. Now, when Debra and Alton approached the two girls, they didn't seem too alarmed. And that was probably because Debra was with Alton. Now, if he was by himself and approached them, they probably wouldn't have reacted the same way. But either way, Debra asked the girls if she can give them a bag of clothes. So at first they said no. But while Debra was trying to entice the girls to go with her and Alton, Alton disappeared somewhere. And then the girls ultimately agreed to go with Debra. So while they're walking with Debra, she's trying to engage them in conversation and distract them by asking them about this bag of clothes that she offered them. So by this time, Debra had led the girls into the woods, where Alton suddenly reappeared. So when he reappears, he tells the girls that he wants to take them back to his grandma's house so they can play a little game. And then all of a sudden, he grabs Tamika, rips her shirt off, and cuts it into pieces with his pocket knife. So with Tamika's shredded shirt, he used the pieces to tie up and gag the girls. And then Debra decides to jump in. So about this time, she and Alton are working together, beating and smothering Tamika until she stopped breathing. So once they were done working on Tamika, Alton then raped Annie, and the both of them choked Annie until she passed out. Once this was done, Alton went back to Tamika and strangled her to death with a strip of fabric. When it was all said and done, they left the two girls laying lifeless in the woods. But Annie had surprisingly survived. Hours later, little Annie regained consciousness, and she frantically searched for her niece, but she was nowhere to be found. She was luckily able to stumble out of the woods where some passerbyers seen her bleeding and called the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they found sweet little Annie, and some distance away, they found Tamika's lifeless body laying in some bushes. After being brought to the hospital, Annie was able to describe descriptive details of the attack, and she made it very clear that Debra was an active participant in every step of this horrifying attack, not just a passive accomplice. And little did everybody know, Alton and Debra's reign of terror was just beginning. You see, the day after Tamika's murder, Vernita Wheat's body was finally found in the vacant Waukegan building where Alton had left her 3 weeks earlier. Her cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation, and for this, Alton was indicted for her murder. But he was nowhere to be found. So now that these two bozos were officially on the run and living off the grid, they had to rely heavily on asking strangers for help. And surprisingly, all the strangers they came in contact with, they were all charmed by the little act they put on. So during this time period, they would find people on the road, of course introduce themselves with fake names, and then these nice strangers would let these two crazy people stay in their homes as house guests for a couple of days. I just don't know how these people were able to do it. No, you cannot stay in my house. It was nice to meet you, but bye. So after Vernita's body was found, Alton and Debra were still on the prowl for their next victims. So while still in Gary, Indiana, they head to a church. And while there, they pose as a couple of Bostonians by the name of Phil and Pam. I wonder what they made their Boston accents sound like. Probably real convincing. But they spark up a conversation with a 25-year-old woman by the name of Donna Williams. Now, Donna was a devoted Christian, so Alton and Debra expressed interest in joining the church where Donna volunteered. But I'm sure there was some time in between their first encounter and when Donna was last seen alive. Because the day she went missing, she was setting up chairs for church service, and she left saying that she was going to go pick up Alton and Debra, and that was the last time she was ever seen or heard from. It's not exactly known what took place when she went to go pick them up, but we do know that she was in her car with them when they drove 3 hours away to Detroit. Once they got to Detroit, they took her to an abandoned building. Alton, of course, raped and strangled her to death, and they left her just like little Vernita. Now, all of this has happened within a span of only 6 days, because on June 24th, while they were in Detroit, they forced themselves into another woman's car at knife point. Then they demanded she drive them to Ohio. But this woman was like, oh, heck no. She decided to take her chances wrecking her car over getting kidnapped. So she drove her car into oncoming traffic in order to get away. And she made it. Now, luckily, after this incident, the woman reported it to police. And at that point, arrest warrants were then issued for Alton and Debra in Detroit. And instead of heading to Ohio like they suggested they were going to, they actually stayed in Detroit. So after a few days had passed, the police in Detroit ended up finding an abandoned car with Debra's ID inside. And at this point, they had to call the FBI to help bring them down because who the heck do Alton and Debra think they are? So instead of moving around town looking for victims like they had been doing, they decided to put their two half-brains together and lay low for a couple days. Y'all, so listen to this. According to police, Alton was a master of disguise. Apparently, he would regularly dye his hair different colors, and then he would grow out his facial hair. They also said that he would change his clothes in between crimes. He would look like a businessman in one crime, and then a homeless man at the next. Such great disguises, Alton. But he was a really cocky criminal, and he always thought that he was smarter and one step ahead. Like, for real, he had no fear of being caught. And Lil Deb just followed his lead. So feeling real confident that they were above the laws and they wouldn't get caught, on June 28th, they decided to drive to Dearborn Heights, Michigan. And this is where they committed their first home invasion. So while in Dearborn Heights, they broke into the home of an elderly couple by the name of Palmer and Maggie Jones. They brutally beat them with a club, stole $86 from them, and then left in their car. Over the next few days, these folks then went back to Detroit where they robbed four more people. Just as they had done with Donna, they befriended the victims, gained their trust, then boom, they stole whatever money they had on them and then they took their cars. But luckily, unlike Donna, none of these victims were killed. But it wasn't long before their murder spree continued, because on July 5th, when they made it to Toledo, Ohio, posing as newcomers to a church community again, they met a local reverend who invited them to his home. So while at the reverend's house, they meet a recently divorced mom by the name of Virginia Temple. So Virginia very kindly invites Alton and Debra to stay with her. Now, as far as Virginia was concerned, they were just a sweet young couple who just needed a place to lay their head for the night. So they kept up this church-going facade for a while, but sometime within the next few days, they showed their true colors. So this single mother sees a struggling couple and she decides to be a blessing to them. And while they're in her home, they rape and strangle her to death, and then they do the same thing to her oldest 9-year-old daughter. They then hid the bodies in the crawl space under Virginia's house, and then they just left. Later that same day, they approached an elderly couple at their home and tried to charm them and ask them if they can use their phone. So once the couple let them inside, they then tied them up with cords and of course stole their cash and their car. But they did leave them alive and unharmed. Now, I don't know why they chose to keep certain victims alive and then kill others. That we'll never know. But after robbing this elderly couple, their next stop was Dayton, Ohio. While there, they found another reverend, stayed a couple nights with him and his wife, and then on July 10th, the reverend dropped them off in downtown Cincinnati. And just a day later, they claimed their sixth life while on the run. So if you haven't been keeping up, Alton killed 9-year-old Vernita Wee on May 29th, and that set off a chain reaction of events in this killing spree. So he and Debra skipped town and they head to Gary, Indiana. There they assaulted two little girls, Tamika Turks and Annie Hillard, and Tamika Turks did not survive the attack. Then before leaving Gary, Indiana, they meet 25-year-old Donna Williams. They drive her 3 hours away to Detroit, and her body was found in an abandoned building days later. They rob an elderly couple and a couple of other people in Detroit. And then in Ohio, they take the life of the single mother by the name of Virginia Temple and her 9-year-old daughter. And now, on June 24th, as 15-year-old Tawny Story is walking home from her after-school computer class, she's interrupted by Alton and Debra. Now, it's not exactly sure how this encounter went, whether or not they lured her to come willingly, or if they had forced her a gun or knife point. But either way, Tawny was last seen alive that evening by a classmate who saw her walking with Debra and Alton around 6 p.m. So that particular evening, she was lured into an abandoned building in the Evanston neighborhood of Cincinnati. Alton then raped her, and they both strangled her and then left her body in the abandoned building. And that same day in Detroit, authorities finally found Donna's body. So a couple days later on July 13th, these idiots rode stolen bikes from Dayton all the way to Norwood, Ohio. I looked it up, and that is a 6-hour bike ride. These folks were really on the run, like persistent, okay? But while in Norwood, they stopped in a nice, quiet, middle-class neighborhood, landing right outside the home of Harry and Marlene Walters, a couple in their 40s. So when Harry answers the door, Alton starts asking him about the camper that he has marked for sale in the driveway. So Harry and Marlene end up asking Alton and Debra if they would like to join them for a cup of coffee on the porch. So Alton is smooth talking in full charm effect right now. Now, it was said that Alton could meet anybody off the street and talk about religion, politics. He was just very well spoken. So the fact that he was a criminal, a murderer, makes him even 10 times worse because you never see him coming. So after chit-chatting on the porch for a while, the Walters invite Debra and Alton inside. Now, as soon as they get inside, Harry goes upstairs to grab the title for the camper, and then the mood immediately turns. Alton knocked Marlene over the head, cracking her skull and mutilating her face and scalp. And then when Harry came back downstairs, he knocked him over the head too, and then he stabbed him in the chest. They then tied their hands up and left them for dead. But before leaving, they stole jewelry, money, and of course their car. Marlene ended up dying from her injuries. Harry survived, but he was left with severe brain damage. But at the Walters house, they were showing that they were getting really careless. Alton left his fingerprints all over the crime scene. So something interesting that was left behind at this crime scene was a bracelet left underneath Marlene's body, which belonged to their fourth victim, Virginia Temple. So authorities are thinking that if this was left there deliberately, then Alton was most likely trying to taunt them. So a few miles southwest of the Walters home, the investigation in Cincinnati was in full effect. And on July 19th, Tawny Story's body was finally found. And again, Alton's fingerprints were all over the crime scene. So at Tawny's crime scene, investigators start to notice a pattern. It was here when they noticed a watch belonging to one of the elderly women they robbed. So at this point, the hunt for them is on, and the couple can feel the walls closing in on them. So they drive the Walters car out of state and finally dump it in Lexington, Kentucky. So while in Williamsburg, Kentucky, they kidnap 45-year-old Olin Carmichael Jr. So while he's walking to his car, they walk up on him and ambush him. They force him into his truck, and then they drive him back to Dayton, Ohio. Now the next day, the police find the abandoned truck. Olin was still in it. He was shaken up, but they left him alive. So after ditching Olin in his car, they zipped right on back over to the Reverend's house who they stayed with the week prior. Because as soon as I seen them through the peephole, I would have shut all the blinds and turned off all the lights. I done helped y'all out once, now go away. So when they get to the Reverend's house, this time they weren't nice. They were strictly business, literally guns blazing. But Alton assured him that he wasn't going to kill him. Instead, he stole their car and beelined towards Illinois. On July 17th, the FBI went ahead and added Alton to its top 10 most wanted fugitive list, but it made him a special edition number 11. But that same day as they're heading for Illinois, they go ahead and stop in Indianapolis where they claim their last victim, 77-year-old Eugene Scott. They forced this old man out of his car and into a ditch near Interstate 65, where they shot and stabbed him to death. And then they took Eugene's car and drove the rest of the way to Illinois. On July 20th, an old acquaintance from around the way recognized Alton just casually walking the streets, so he hurried up and called the police on him. So an undercover police officer followed Debra and Alton to a basketball court at Mason Park. And while they sat on the bleachers chilling, watching the pickup game, they had no idea that they were being surrounded. So as they got up to leave, the police swooped in and arrested their asses. But when arrested, they of course gave fake names, and they insisted that the police made a mistake. Nah, we know that's y'all. They were taken into custody, and their bail was set for $25 million apiece. So when they did finally go to trial, Alton's case was pretty open and closed. Everybody knew he did it. He had a long rap sheet, and on top of that, he left fingerprints at almost every one of his crime scenes. Now, Debra, on the other hand, was a little bit different. The evidence against her was more circumstantial. Now, although there was a number of victims who placed her with Alton and the victims, there was no actual physical evidence against her. And on top of that, she had no criminal history. So Debra's defense went ahead and painted her as a helpless victim of Alton's influence, even describing her as being under his spell. But when the authorities interviewed Debra, she confessed to the crimes, offering details that were later used against Alton in court, though. But her attorneys continue to argue that she was a slave master in the relationship with Alton. But a jury didn't buy it. So in the cases of Tawny Story and Marlene Walters, Debra and Alton were both found guilty. And during sentencing, Debra was still trying to cover for her man. She claimed that it wasn't Alton who killed Marlene, and Alton went ahead and rolled her right under the bus. He said, "Yeah, I didn't do it. She was the one all doped up at the time. I was out the room when she killed Marlene." And Debra's retarded self even slipped a note to the judge that reportedly said, quote, "I killed a bitch, and I don't give a damn. I had fun out of it," end quote. But the judge didn't buy her little note. It was said that since Alton was facing the death penalty, and Debra wasn't, she was still trying to protect him by claiming responsibility. But either way, Debra was a willing participant in everything that took place over this 7-week crime spree that they went on. She had no problem luring the victims, robbing them, and then even holding them down while Alton did what he did to them. So with all the evidence and witnesses presented against Debra, plus all the obvious evidence that connected Alton to the crimes, including his fingerprints, eyewitnesses, surviving witnesses, so on and so forth. And in the cases of Tawny and Marlene, they were both sentenced to death. But wait, y'all, we still have a little bit more sentencing to go. So they still had to face a jury in Indiana. And when it came to the rape and murder of 9-year-old Tamika Turks, Alton was given an additional 100 years, and Debra was given an additional 40. And in Illinois, the case of Vernita, Alton was also given the death penalty, making him the only person in U.S. history to be sentenced to death in 3 states. So Alton sat on death row all the way until April 26 of 2002, and he was killed by lethal injection at the age of 46. But when it came to Debra, she was given clemency, and in January of 1991, her death sentence was commuted to a life sentence. Now, the decision to grant her clemency was made on the basis of evidence that Debra was, quote, intellectually disabled in a way that made her vulnerable to Alton's influence, end quote. Now, she still remains in prison in Ohio to this day, and her death row sentence in Illinois still remains active. All right, y'all. Well, that pretty much wraps up this week's case on the fake-ass Bonnie and Clyde story of Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. As always, I'll see you guys back here same place, same time next week.